and welcome, Karin. I have to say, really a special welcome and thank you that you made it to Bielefeld. Karin Tybjerg comes from Copenhagen and very environmentally friendly. She took the train and was stuck for several hours yesterday, so only arrived in Bielefeld at 2 a.m. So I think we really need to be very thankful that she's here with us today. I've known Karin Tybjerg for several years. It has been a great pleasure to work with her on her current project that is about diagnosis, the history and philosophy of diagnosis, but also the history in diagnosis. And that's kind of like a general, I think, approach that runs through much of Karin Tybjerg's work, to kind of like think about both the history of medicine and the history in medicine. And I'm very, very happy that she will also present something of that work, this time related to Anamnesis, here at the colloquium today, because it really brings together these questions of materiality and objects, and writing the history and questioning theories of both how we think about medicine, but also how we think about history. Karin Tybjerg did her PhD and a research fellowship at the History and Philosophy of Science department in Cambridge, and then moved to Copenhagen, and there she's an associate professor in the Department of Public Health and at the Medical Museum, which is, I think, one of the most beautiful history of medicine museums, and that also has really a research center for history of medicine there, that Karin heads. And yeah, I think this kind of like double approach, being both kind of like in the academic surroundings, but also working on a day-to-day basis with the collections, curating exhibitions, and dealing with them, informs much of her work. And the very interesting thing that I would like to also showcase here is that she kind of like both writes publications about these theoretical questions that then inspire her curatory practice, and then she kind of like learns from the exhibitions and publishes again on what she kind of like learned from these exhibitions. And so she has, for instance, published a lot on the concept of scale, using the idea of scale from the whole body down to the DNA that is stored in a biobank, thinking about it theoretically, then making an exhibition about the collected body, and then again writing about how that experience informed rethinking scale. So I can only kind of like suggest to look at her publications. And now, without further ado, Karin, thank you so much again for taking the long trip to come to Bielefeld. We're very happy to have you here, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? And back to you. I was horrified first time I heard it, because I was used to the clapping, but now I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for your patience, and thank you so much for inviting me here to the Center of Materiality Between Past and Future, and to be part of this Theory Colloquium. I'm really, truly delighted to be in a group that combines the interests in historical theory and a keen interest in the material sources and layerings of history. And I was so delighted to hear of this object session, and it would have been wonderful to participate in, because as you will all also see in this paper, I am, and as Lara rightly said in her wonderful kind introduction, I work in between doing exhibitions and working with objects, and working on the history and philosophy of medicine. What I'll present today is not sort of traditional medical history, as you may figure out, dealing with a particular setting and context. Rather, it's a bit of a flight through many centuries that will attempt to link together history and medicine and museology. My main errand today is to show many different ways in which history is present in medicine. And these are both cultural and biological, and also intertwine the two. So there's the natural history of disease, so the actual disease and how it develops. There's the history of patients' memories. There's history in the collected professional experience and in disease classifications, as well as in the development of medicine itself. So you see here all these different kinds of histories that we can unearth from medicine. And these different strands are tied together. The key concept I'll use today to unlock this understanding of history of medicine is a medical term. It's anamnesis. So simply put, an anamnesis is what the doctor does when they ask their patient about their complaint and symptoms. So, you know, when did your headaches start, etc., etc. And in addition, they ask about the sort of disease history and the social situation. This is then supplemented with the doctor observing their patient and conducting a physical examination and possibly tests. All this material is gathered and the doctor will try to discern a kind of cluster of symptoms, Krankenbild, yes, or a recognizable development over time that led to a diagnosis. So the term anamnesis comes from Greek, which means open up, and nesis, which means memory. So it is literally an opening up of the memory. This is linked to the practice of historia, which is also a Greek term, and is a kind of inquiry that's based on observation and accounts of events. So what I want to sort of pick up here is that the terminology of anamnesis and taking a history, they point not just to the empirical nature of medicine, but also to the fact that medicine is intertwined with the historical nature of disease and of medical knowledge. Diseases as well as medical practices have pasts that are necessary and relevant to understanding them, and medicine interweaves current observation with observations from the past to identify, classify, and track disease. So what I want to suggest here is that the practice of anamnesis and taking of history captures important aspects of how we can understand diseases and what diagnoses contribute. The production of medical knowledge draws heavily on history, on material collected from the past, and this material is continually used in order to not just collect, but recollect this knowledge to produce medical categories. And there's several histories at play here, and I have divided it up in three different ones, where I'll start with the actual medical concept of anamnesis and what goes on a little bit in the doctor's surgery, where the patient's personal memory and also generational memory of diseases are unearthed. Then I'll move on to think a little bit about the collections of medicine. I will look at the collected material in pathological collections and biobanks as a form of memory bank of the medical profession. And lastly, I'll look at the historical memory information of disease concepts and classifications, arguing that within the classifications we find a kind of chain back into historical understandings of disease. Right. So the plan of the talk is to first go a little bit into the background of Anamnesis and Historia. Then I will look at these 3 layers of history that are found in medicine, and then I'll end with some reflections about history, medicine, collections, and anamnesis. So if we start with the background, anamnesis was made famous by Plato in his dialogues, most notably the Meno. And his idea is that in the Meno, Socrates talks so Plato's proponent Socrates talks to a slave boy, and he helps this slave boy make a mathematical proof. And Plato argues that he does not teach the slave boy the proof. He simply unearths the memory that the slave boy already has of mathematical knowledge. So I won't go into this idea of knowledge in Plato, that we're all born with our knowledge and it only has to be retrieved. But we see this picture of what also happens in the doctor's surgery, that the disease is in the patient and needs to be unearthed through this conversation. This term is related also to the taking of histories, and that is most famous from Herodotus' histories, and it is a bit of a commonplace that Herodotus does not do history as we know it. So although he is the father of history, he is also someone who mixes observations of geography and ethnography with historical studies. So what we see is a form of knowledge that involves both making observations of what you're interested in, as well as trailing a back history that explains the current conflicts between Greeks and barbarians. So it's a way of observing and recounting history that makes sense of the present situation. This was already linked to medicine in the ancient period, where Hippocrates, some of Hippocrates' works, obviously Hippocrates was not a person as such, but we have all the different treatises, and in his epidemics, his work closely resembles Herodotus' practice. Here he assembles 42 accounts of causes and disease that are based on sense perception and evidence, as well as autopsy. So seeing the situation yourself rather than actually doing the dissection. He notes the symptoms and their order very carefully, and this helped the ancient doctor establish a pattern of disease that he could use to ascertain his authority, both by telling the patient symptoms that they have had, but that they didn't mention to the doctor. So that's a very powerful way of showing your medical expertise, is you can say, I bet you also had cold sweats at night. And then the patient said, yes, indeed I did. And this emphasizes the knowledge of the doctor, but also allows the doctor to prognosticate about the future. So we see these collected case histories in this Historia as a way, again, to connect the past, the present tense, and the prognosis. Historia became also a very important mode of inquiry practice in the early modern periods, where Pomata and Ciresi has done a wonderful study of how Historia moves across different disciplines. It also moves across different practices within medicine. And we find two different kinds of genre of medical historia, and one is the anatomical historia, and the other is the medical historia. And here we again see this combination of describing something very carefully, as goes on in the anatomical historia, which is the dissections, and where the whole dissection is described in painstaking detail to describe the situation inside the body, whereas the medical historia are accounts of case histories. So we have this crossing in this form of knowledge between following causes of diseases and also making observations and describing them very carefully. Interestingly, in 18th century, the normal medical history then focuses on the birth of disease specificity. So the idea that you can think about the disease as a particular entity and not as a feature of the person who has the disease. This process is normally located in the Paris hospitals, as described, for instance, by Foucault in Birth of the Clinic. But two scholars of classification, Mendelssohn and Hess, studied the paperwork of Bourgeois de Sauvage, and found that what he was doing was a compilation of old case histories and systematizing them into his classification and nosology of disease. So his work with classifying disease, but this was built on these philological paperwork methods of compiling case studies, compiling material from the whole back library of medicine. So what they say is that created these more generalized disease categories, and generalization replaced collection, category work replaced accumulation. I don't, in a sense, agree quite with this idea that the generalization replaced the collection, because I think that the categories emerge from the collections and that they continue to emerge out of collections. But I do agree that these disease classification, the emergence of specific categories, that they might be seen as what they say the crowning achievement of historia. So this kind of knowledge they see as what created the idea of disease classifications, rather than just the clinical pathological correlation from the Paris hospitals. I also want to extend this argument to material collections. And it's actually quite interesting that Mendelssohn and Hess themselves talk about the process of Sauvage in establishing these classifications as a practice akin to beetle collecting. So he does paperwork, but it's like beetle collecting. And I think, well, why not actually look at the collection practices of medicine, not just in the form of paper, but also in the form of material collections. And we can think about this clustering practice of objects within collection as a recollection practices, and see this approach, this anamnesis, as not just in one episode of medical history, but in several episodes of medical history. Right. But in working with these different ways in which history plays a role in medicine, I'll start with these personal and generational memories. And I'll start with this particular object from our collections, which is a heart taken from a 17-year-old girl. The doctors who wrote the case notes must have been were concerned to offer a history and not just a note that this acute disease caused death. So they gave this background of what happened to the girl. So the case notes say that the deceased had run approximately 2 kilometers holding a heavy suitcase to the so-called garden section during a recreational stay. She then complained of pain in the back and chest and occasionally vomited. The condition lasted for 2 days until 12 in the morning, when she was found lying dead, fallen out of bed. The autopsy showed a pea-sized irregular rupture in apparently microscopically healthy part of the aorta, indicated with the marker here. But they furthermore noted, so what happened here was that the blood came in to between the walls in the aorta. So that was why it was acute, but took a little time to actually spread down the vessel wall. The medical notes, however, also contains the information that this girl had previously suffered from a list of diseases that almost offer a history of medicine in itself. Before she died, 17 years old, in 1929, she had pneumonia and mumps in 1917. She then had the Spanish flu and diphtheria in 1919. She had the whooping cough in 1920, and in 1924 she had jaundice. And then she died in 1929 of her ruptured aorta. These two accounts are not linked together. So the traditional case notes of what happened just before she died is not linked. It's just informed that she had those diseases. But it does seem that the doctor must have had a suspicion that this further history, that wasn't just the natural history of the disease itself, had an impact on this case, and that the sort of bodily history influenced this case. And I think this is the case not just physically in the body, but also in our memory, so not just bodily memory, but also generational memories. And I haven't done a lot of work interviewing patients, but some colleagues of mine have been doing a lot of patient interviews, and they have often found that although it's not part of the question protocol, the patients will often talk about how their older family members suffer from various diseases, particularly, or think about people that they experienced as children having these diseases. For instance, a person who was newly diagnosed with diabetes just spontaneously said, then I'm going to have my foot amputated. And the anthropologist inquired into this, and they explained that their grandmother had had their foot amputated because of diabetes. And I think this account, and it's actually also the case with another colleague who's done this work. So I think what this reveals is that our understanding of disease is also historical, in the sense that we form our notions of diseases as children when we hear of elderly people who have diseases, and it's that understanding of disease that we take with us untouched until we get diagnosed with diseases ourselves, and we apply that rather than necessarily a current understanding. This is something that gives problems with cancer patients, where overdiagnosis is a problem, and if patients get diagnosed with cancer cells, they will often wish for an operation even against medical advice. So they get told that there are cancerous cells, but it's better to wait and see whether it develops. But they want to be operated and have them taken out. And this is because their notion of cancer is formed 2 generations ago with the idea that cancerous cells equals a situation that leads to death, and that must be operated for. So in that sense, both our bodies and understandings of diseases take this shape, both from generations before, as well as from our own history. Right. Now I move on to the professional cases and the professional memory of cases and lesions. In medical education, experience weighs heavily, and it's often emphasized that medical knowledge requires punishing hours in pursuit of seeing large numbers of cases. So you have to be in the clinic seeing a lot of cases. This was very much also the case in the 19th century, where the cases were not just seen in the clinic, but often the doctor who treated the patient would also do the autopsy as well. So in the 19th century, a lot of diseases were at a terminal stage, and thus there was a great probability that the doctor would both see the clinical case and the autopsy. And doing that, many medical doctors collected private collections of the lesions that they had cut out. So many surgeons would have their own little pathological collections that would be all the cases they'd seen in their lifetime, thus establishing a kind of mini museum documenting their medical experience. So they could have that as a kind of back library of their professional memory and their professional experience. These little private collections were then merged in collections that belonged to hospitals and to universities. And in that sense, we can see in quite a physical way how medicine moves from individual experience and onto institutional or disciplinary medical knowledge, that we can see the medical knowledge being created as the individual experiences of the doctors in the shape of medical pathological collections are merged together in bigger collections that are then being categorized to produce an overview of the landscape of disease and to understand diseases as entities. So here we also see, in parallel to Savage's work, how the medical experience with a new understanding of disease that's based on pathological lesions rather than the earlier one, which was based on symptoms. But this understanding also took that step from particular to general via a collection and a kind of layering and putting together of medical expertise or medical memory. So we can see these categories of disease that emerge from this as a product of a disciplinary memory. My argument is that this is not something that is solely in the historical collections that we see that, and it's not so that medical museums collections, that was something of the past, but now biomedicine is a laboratory science. Actually, collections continue to be at large and take incredible amounts of resources in medicine, as collections are just created at the level of the body that has particular interest to medicine at the time. So we can see you want to make a big collection that takes resources. So it's possible to ascertain which level is seen as the most important level for understanding a disease by looking at what is collected in a given period. So these collections provide a history of medicine where we can see in the pathological collections the lesion was the basic element of disease. When you get, these are boxes full of biopsies and microscope slides from the main hospital in Copenhagen. There the cellular level, the tissue, was the most important level. And this collection here is a bunch of children from a biobank on allergy, taking blood samples as well as data about these children. And Denmark is tying enormous amounts of resources in a national biobank or and also a genome center that has both the physical part and the data part of the modern medical collection. And what we see is also that it's clear that that the doctors collected their past experience, but also in the modern collections, we are interested in using the collections to see the past of medicine, but there it's collected with a view to being looked back upon. So that's why the children allergy, that's an easy collection to make because the diseases come out relatively early, and you can wait for your collection to be useful for making medical knowledge, because the diseases debut early on. But if you want to understand diseases that occur later in life, then you might need to go back into historical biobanks in order to predict how, for instance, a fatty liver might develop as you approach old age, because that would be hard to make biobanks for today. But that's to say that the history is not having a smaller role in medicine, even though medicine now seems to be kind of lab-based and laboratory-based, but actually more past is necessary because we want to prognosticate further into the future. So we need samples of people who have had their whole medical life to look back on in order to predict and categorize out into the future. Okay, we can also in these collections, there is a kind of development where the temporality has different roles. In the early pathological collections, the patients were dead when the organs were taken out and placed in the collections, So at that point, we have the same time in terms of a sort of history of disease in the collection. It's all collected at the time of death. So it's very easy to categorize these preparations of lesions because they're taken at the same time of disease. But doctors were also interested in seeing how disease unfolded, and that is physically an issue in an object collection. How do you show both classifications and also get a kind of sense of how a disease might develop? So that is like diachrone and synchrone issue in all history writing, but this can be seen physically in the collections. But Virchow actually tried in his collection in the Charité to dissect so many people that he was able to collect lesions from different people to make developmental histories of different diseases, so take them from different patients. And to do that, he needed to make these total dissections, where he also looked for early stages of disease in people who might have died from something completely different. We also see an attempt at the same time here, Pitt Rivers, on the evolution of culture, who in the Pitt Rivers Museum tried to both categorize different forms of weapons and show how culture, the evolution of culture, showing developmental orders. Time also comes into medicine as experiments actually try to create disease, and thus enables medicine to document some of the developments of disease, and the temporality is very much at play in modern medicine now, where it's actually trajectories of disease that gets classified. Okay, last bit here, and that harks back to some of the material that we have been dealing with before, that there is a history in the classifications of disease. But let me just first say a couple of general points about memories in classifications. Nosologies and disease classifications emerged in the late 17th century. But as more scholars made various classifications and nosologies, it became important to be able to relate your classification to previous classifications. Because as we have learned, medicine needs to learn from its past, and in order to do that, it's important that they are talking about the same diseases. So although classifications change, they are always very careful about pointing back to previous classifications. So much effort is made to say, okay, I have moved this disease to another class, but in these different previous classifications, it was classified in this way. So in a sense, we can create this path back of how diseases have moved around in different classificatory categories. And we can see how classifications kind of enfold their history. And because of this sort of demand of stability, you will often hang on to a classification, even though it doesn't fit current science, just in order that it's the same so that you can use your history. Another side to it is that and that's part of why these classifications change, is that classifications need to prioritize dimensions. So they have to say, first, we organize things according to whether they're fevers or not fevers, according to whether you have too much tension or not tension, according to where it is in the body. There has to be some dimensions according to which you classify. And that might be symptoms, it might be anatomical region, it might be a particular physiological dysfunction. But this means that if you choose any one of these, you will downplay other aspects of that disease because you can't classify according to all of them at the same time. And we can see this at play if we look at some classification history here of cancer and diabetes, where we can see that in the early classifications in late 18th and early 19th centuries, there diabetes fits with classifications because the classificatory systems are very much according to excess and lack of fever or of tension in the body, or excess, something has swollen or shrunk. Because diabetes is characterized by excess of urination and often also of starvation, then it fits very well into the categories here. If we look back and try to localize cancers and tumors in this system, then we find them all over in the classificatory systems. Sometimes they are seen as local diseases, sometimes they're seen as general diseases affecting the whole body, sometimes they're seen as wounds, or sometimes they're seen as something where the liquid has been blocked. If we then move on to the 19th and 20th century, classification begins to be much more focused because of all the pathological studies of medicine and the autopsies. Then classification systems become more to do with localized anatomy. Where in the body did you find this disease? And here cancer fitted very well because it was often localized in a particular body part. And that is also how cancers are classified today, according to which part of the body they are located in. Diabetes, on the other hand, had a kind of remarked lack of lesions. They weren't able to find anything. They weren't able to say which part of the body the problem was in. So then diabetes started to move around the classes. And what happened in the 21st century is that cancer and diabetes are separated, and cancer is organized according to its anatomical position, but in a category on its own. And diabetes sits in a really weird class of endocrine, metabolic, and dietary diseases, where the rest of the system deals more with anatomical systems. So in that sense, it has almost kind of imported another kind of classification. This also means that the research in the two fields have been extremely separate. And in that sense, now with genomics, biomedical researchers are starting to employ similar methods, but also trying to understand the diseases in new ways. But this has been made difficult by the past history where they've been separated. So I guess what I want to point at with this is a kind of historical path dependence of where a disease ends up. So if you have downplayed an aspect in the past, then it can almost disappear from the understanding of the disease, even though it might have been there previously, and then make separations between the diseases where that hides similarities between diseases that end up in separate categories. So, for instance, within cancer, it's found that there are more connections between certain form of breast and colon cancer than there are between specific forms of breast cancer. So in that way, the anatomical history classification has given a way of understanding the diseases, has left traces. That means that there are certain similarities that get hidden. Right. Just to wind up here, what we find is that history is present in medicine at several levels. We find it in the medical anamnesis and personal and bodily understandings of diseases. We can find it in a kind of disciplinary anamnesis based on the collections, where the collections materialize experience and allow an accumulation and organization that creates disease categories. And then we find the history at the institutional and bureaucratic level, where the classifications carry historical understandings with them, because these understandings have previously been shutting off some paths of inquiry. We might also turn it around a little bit and think of anamnesis as a way to do history. Often when dealing with medical history, particularly as I do, moving up between different centuries, there is a danger that you forget the particular historical context. There's also the danger of doing what's called retroactive diagnosis, so that you use your present understanding of disease and impose it on the diseases of the past, doing a kind of weak history of medicine that hides the local historical conditions. But what I'm arguing is that anamnesis is a way in which we can connect the present to the past that sidepasses some of the evilness of retroactive diagnosis, because we are trying to diagnose, we are running an anamnesis on the present. So we're not imposing the present on the past, but we are tracing back through the historical links, classifications back into the past, and understanding the past in that way from the position of the present, but also understanding just how much the past is folded in and in-baked in the understanding that we have now. So we want to be open about the present, informing it from history. And then lastly, medicine might contribute to general history, was my little hope in this context. And thinking about history itself as a kind of diagnostic process, where which perhaps more than it lets on, we all know that we write our histories for the present, and in the way of Herodotus do a diagnosis on the present by digging into the past. Thank you.